Esiet sveicināti, sarksalvai skatītāji. Izraēla kopš pagājušā gada 7. oktobra saskaras ar nepārtrauktu karu starp tās aizsardzības spēkiem un teroristu grupējumu Hamās, kas vienas nakts laikā burtiski sagriez zemi ar debesīm otrādi un izveica daudz un dažādas kara noziegumus, iebrukot Izraēlā, nogalinot cilvēkus, izvarojot, laupot un arī aizvedot sev līdzi kā ķīlniekus. Karš jau norisinās vairākus mēnešus, bet pagaidām, diemžēl, galu tam neredz. Jāteic, ka šī terorakta sarīkošanā, kā viens no iesaistītajiem aktieriem, tika uzskatīta Irāna. Tomēr pēdējie pierādījumi liecina, ka līdzās Irānai iespējams terorakta sagatavošanā ir piedalījusies arī citu valsts, agresoru valsts Krievija, kas jau šobrīd vada asiņainu karu Ukrainā. Par to, kā šo divu nedemokrātisko valstu savstarpējā sadarbība varētu ietekmēt gan drošību tuvajos austrumos, gan arī šeit Eiropā, par to mēs mūsu ekspertu klubā sarunāsimies ar Atlantic Council nerezidējošā pētnieku Deniju Citrinovicu. Hello, Mr. Citrinovics.
Hello.
I must admit that you have also served 25 years in the different positions of IDF intelligence teams, right?
Indeed.
Okay. We really remember what happened in 7th of October last year, and we saw those terrible pictures. At the beginning, I remember that Prime Minister of Israel said that you can see there a hand of Iran, but also there are some evidences also from our sources that Iran wasn't alone in this attack. And also there was a participation of the Russian hackers and another actors from the aggressor state, Russia. Do you already have some more proofs about that involvement of the Russia in attacks on Israel? And what can you tell about that to us?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. Let's talk a little bit about the 7th of October in terms of Iran. Iran is supportive of what we call the ITN, the Iranian Threat Network. One of those is Hamas. Hamas is the military branch of this group called the ITN. Yeah. Iran supported militarily, economically, and for sure, given the strategic cooperation between Hamas and Iran probably knew that this attack is going to happen. I don't know if Iran knew exactly the time, the location, but they probably knew what will happen, and they took a strategic decision from the 7th of October to make sure that Hamas will prevail. That is why they're instructing their proxies in order to put pressure on Israel to stop a war against Hamas. Now, regarding Russia, we don't know what Russia knew before, but it's obviously that after the 7th of October, Russia is backing the Iranian axis. Politically, we see the support from the National Security Council, we see the public support, but also Russia support Hamas directly. We had numerous visits of Hamas leadership in Moscow. But as Nikki Haley just said a couple of days ago in Israel, Russia is also helping in intelligence-wise, meaning that it supports the axis, Iran, Hamas, giving intelligence on Israel activity. So actually, Russia is highly involved in this activity, and not to the support of Israel, but to the support of Iran.
Mm-hmm. We watched one interesting thing in the tactics. For example, Hamas terrorists used drone attacks to Israeli military personnel and equipment. It was quite similar that they're using right now in Ukraine, for example.
Actually, it's a very important point. Iran is a proliferator of UAV capabilities. What we see happening now in Ukraine, of course, is the fact that they send to Russia what we call the Shahed variants and the Mohajer variants.
Well, the Russians think and wants to give the information for the rest of the world that they are producing themselves.
Yeah, they're producing themselves and they're changing the names. Yes. But everything is, whether it's made in Iran or the blueprint is Iranian. We all know that now they have a joint factory, they're building those drones together. So, but the fact that Iran sent the drones to Ukraine, it's not the only place that they send those drones. They send the drones to the rest of the members of the ITN, like the Houthis in Yemen, the Shia militias in Iraq, but also Hamas in Gaza. Even now, not sending the UAV itself, they're sending the ideas, the know-how to build these kind of capabilities. That is why we need to counter it. We need to make sure that Iran will stop being a proliferator of conventional capabilities, because see what's happening now. The Russians are using that in order to attack infrastructure in Ukraine. The Houthis are using the Iranian capabilities to block Bab el Mandeb Straits. So we need to have a coalition to counter this kind of an activity.
Mm-hmm. You already mentioned that Russia is providing Hamas with the intelligence information, but have some kind of evidences that maybe there was involvement of the Russian instructors from the so-called PMC Wagner group in the training of those terrorists, because the tactics that they used was quite similar that are now doing Russian troops and the mercenaries of the Russia in the territory of the Ukraine.
Actually, as you know, since 2015, Wagner Spetsnaz are working together in Syria, together with Hezbollah from Lebanon, together with the Shiite militias in Iran, in order to save Bashar al-Assad and to counter what they say the Syrian opposition. So they are doing so, and they're enhancing this kind of cooperation. So building on that, we cannot rule out that this know-how actually trickled down to Hamas. We don't know, but one can suspect it happened. The problem that we have right now is the fact that the growing cooperation between Iran and Russia is really put Israel in a real danger, because you have this kind of tactical cooperation, but also you have strategic one in terms of transferring the knowledge, the intelligence, but also the fact that we see close cooperation in space. The Russians just launched the Qiyam satellite of the Iranians. We know that there's strong cooperation in terms of cyber. Actually, look what's happening today in Israel. We are exposed to what we call information campaigns or influence campaigns coming from Russia and Iran alike. So actually what Israel is dealing today is not only dealing with the Iranian axis, but Iranian axis connected to Russia.
Mm-hmm. How about other terrorist groups and the support of the Russia for them? For example, we know that Hamas is the one problem, but there is also Hezbollah in the north of Israel.
Definitely concerning. As I mentioned, Hezbollah and Russia working, Russian forces working in Syria together. They know each other. They know how they share knowledge. And there are numerous reports that the Russians intend to transfer capabilities to Hezbollah itself, like anti-aircraft capabilities. We all know that some weapons that arrived to Syria, Russian weapon, like the Ahond missiles, found itself to the hands of Hezbollah itself, and we cannot rule out that the Russians knew about it. So the support of Russia is not only support to Iran itself, but also to support to the proxies like Hezbollah, and actually enhancing their cooperation. Take, for example, the intelligence issue. If the Russians transformed the information to Iran, for sure that Iran shared the information with Hezbollah because of the close cooperation. So actually, Iran is helping Hezbollah as well in terms of intelligence, and they're using that to improve their capabilities or actions against Israel. So the bottom line of things, this kind of cooperation, alarming, but also very dangerous to the Israel security interests.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned already the influence operations. How can you characterize them? How Russia is getting involved in those operations? And what's the aim of those operations?
Well, as you know, we have a vast Russian population in Israel, Jews that came from Russia to Israel in the last 30 years. And the Russians are exploiting that. The main purpose of Russian influence campaign is making sure that Israel won't support Ukraine. That is why we see vast activity of avatars, of bots in social media, running campaigns, trying to influence the population in Israel and the government in Israel, not changing the policy towards Ukraine. The Russians are fearing probably that Israel, because it's basically in the Western camp, will increase its support to Ukraine and thus will prevent Russia from achieving its strategic goals in Ukraine. That is why they're working hard in the social media sphere to influence our decision-making in that regard. But we see the same thing happening with Iran. Now, Iran is not influencing us regarding Ukraine. They're trying to influence the population in Israel to put pressure on our leadership to stop the war in Gaza. But we're seeing the same technique and procedures, using bots, using avatars, multiple social media platforms, Telegrams, Facebook, Twitter, all of that aim to influence our decision-making, our population. So we see the similarities in that regard.
Unfortunately, given the fact that Israel basically was attacked by terrorists and basically considering that Israel was a victim and a right to for self-defense and right to do those operations that Israel is doing to let's say eliminate those terrorist groups. Unfortunately, in a public, this policy and actions of Israel is not very popular. Do you see that Russia also was involved in this so-called PR campaign against Israel? And do you see that this campaign already gained some kind of results?
So I'll tell you an example that the Russians did. They painted Magen David, the sign of what we have on the Israeli flag, called the Magen David, and it's a sign that symbolizes Judaism. They painted Magen David in France, and actually what they tried to show, and of course they tried to highlight the fact that there is anti-Semitism in France itself. And they echoed the fact that people painted Magen David and against Magen David and all those things in order to make sure that, and echoing that in their social media activity, that people might think that there is a lot of anti-Semitism in France, so building on the hatred for the Jews in France and other places. So they're highly involved in that. But this is only one example. And what actually it shows? It shows that what the Russians are trying to do from day one of the war that was, we have to remember that we didn't ask this war. We were surprised. Our civilians were attacked, were killed, were butchered by Hamas terrorists. And from there on, Israel is retaliating against Hamas. And from the first day, as the Iranians decided to save Hamas, same thing happened with the Russians. In terms of they, I think, decided that they'll have to stop the war and save Hamas. That is why we're seeing them working on social media influence campaigns, but also from political standpoint. They're supportive Hamas. They support any ceasefire that actually save Hamas in Gaza. And of course, they're supporting Iranian political activity in that regard. So we see everything is aligned in terms of pressuring Israel to stop the war and save Hamas in that regard. And unfortunately, we see that happening again and again and again. And we see that the Russians are supporting any initiative in that regard. And as we mentioned earlier, even support the access with Intel that help him to increase the kinetic pressure on Israel itself. So the bottom line of things that since the 7th of October, the Russians weren't on the Israeli side. Definitely they were on the Axis side, helping them achieving their strategic goals.
Mm-hmm. How about the third player, for example? We know that the interests of China is also spreading around the world, and they are not the peacefulest ones. Do you see also some kind of a Chinese influencer?
Well, I think that less than the Russians. I think that the Chinese...
But is there a Chinese influence in this conflict in terms of supporting of one or another terrorist group?
Well, politically, for sure, the Chinese are supporting of Iran. Look what happened with the Houthis, for example. The Houthis put also Chinese interests in danger when they are blocking Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But you didn't see the Chinese are acting harshly against the Houthis because they have strategic cooperation with them and with the Iranians. So in that regard, it's obvious that, again, they are all in the same camp. When we're talking about, it's not Israel against Hamas or Israel against Iran. At the end of the day, when connecting that to the war in Ukraine and the possible war, maybe China against Taiwan, it's an axis against an axis. We have the Western axis that inspires for democracy, that inspires for freedom, and is against a fascist axis that actually counter the Western values. So in that regard, for sure, we'll see the Chinese supporting Iran in their efforts. Now, I don't think they're supporting like the Russians in terms of military equipment or Intel, but I think they have the moral support, the political support that will actually give a backwind to Iran in its activity against Israel. So that is another danger in that regard. And I think that we'll see that being enhanced into the future.
Mm-hmm. Iran and Russia agreed on weapons supply for Russian forces, considering that for some time ago they felt a bit of lack of the weapons because of the damages to the army in Ukraine. Russia got the Iranian drones and missiles. What was that commodity that Russia offered back to Iran?
That's an excellent question, because when you're talking about the cooperation between Iran and Russia, it's not only what Iran is giving to Russia, and we all know the drones, the weapons, maybe the missiles, to help the Russian in its war against Ukraine. But also there is another aspect of what Russia is giving Iran. So we already mentioned the cooperation in space, the fact that they launched together Iranian satellite.
So basically, this is not just some kind of a space technologies, but basically we can talk about intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Well, in the future, and I will get to that as well, what can happen in the future. I think today we have the space cooperation, we have cyber, we only mentioned the influence campaigns, but also defensive cyber, maybe in the future offensive one. We have, of course, the Sukhoi 35 deal that's supposed to happen, I don't know if every day, but it's very close to being completed. We have, of course, another interesting example. You know, the Russian found in Ukraine battlefield an ATGM, Javelin, an American one. Then actually they transferred that to Iran for reverse engineering. So you see cooperation in the military side, military industry side. And we have economical cooperation. Both countries are helping each other to bypass US sanctions. And we have political cooperation and others. So in many terms, you have a vast cooperation, a robust cooperation that is not only a military one, but also politically one and economically one. And it's actually breaking any glass ceiling that we saw in the past. You know, it's not that the Russia and Iran didn't cooperate in the past, but we thought there is some sort of a glass ceiling to this cooperation. But ever since the Russian asked the Iranians help, and Iranian understanding that they can exploit the Russian in that regard, we see that the glass ceiling broke, and elements or venues that we didn't think that we will see cooperation regarding them in the past, we see that happening today. And towards the future, as you mentioned, they can work together on intercontinental ballistic missiles. We know that Iran is looking to enhance its ballistic missile capabilities. We know the Russians can help them a lot. So one can look at that. And of course, there is the issue of the nuclear cooperation. I don't think that the Russians will give a bomb to Iran, but they can find venues cooperation in there as well. Hope they won't cooperate in that, but you cannot rule out anything, given the fact that the Russians really need Iran help, and the Iranians understand they can exploit that in a way that will benefit their security interests.
One big problem for Israel is Iranian nuclear program. We know that Iran is working on the enrichment of the uranium. How significant could be Russian technologies and the access for the Russian technologies for Iran in this regard?
Extremely important. I will say that today the Iranians are highly advanced in terms of enrichment. According to open source information that were published lately, they probably still don't have what we call the weapons group in terms of the people that are taking the fissile materials and building a bomb. But in terms of the fissile materials, they're already in the 90% or very close to. They're not enriching to 90%, not because they can't, it's because they don't want to, because they find it very hard, I think, to anticipate what will be the reaction of the West. The Russians can really help them in two main things, or three main things actually. First is improving their enrichment capabilities. Second is also helping them in building a plutogenic route. The Iranians tried to build a reactor, but they failed, but the Russians really can help them in that. They can also help them in what we call the dual use activity. As you know, there are activities that you can do that can connected to a military activity, nuclear one, but also civilian one. So the Russians can really help them with that. And if the Iranians would decide to cross the threshold and try to build a bomb, the Russians can really help them in the military side of things. Now, I don't know what the Russians will decide to do, but as long as we'll see this cooperation being enhanced, we cannot rule out anything in that regard, including the nuclear issue.
Mm-hmm. Previously, Prime Minister Netanyahu had pretty much good relations with dictator Putin. And doing that, he hoped that he will prevent the direct attack from the Iran to the Israel. Now we have seen that this policy have failed. So is there already some kind of a changes in the politics of Israel towards Russia, and what can we expect in the future?
It's a good question. I think I'll tell you my view on that, and hopefully what the government view on that. Well, I think that we cannot sit on the fence too much more. I think that looking back, Israel tried to stay in the Western camp, but still tried to preserve good relations with Russia because of our need to cooperate our tactical attacks activities in Syria. And of course, we have to remember we have a vast Jewish communities in Russia. But I think that, especially since the 7th of October, we have to be in the Western camp. We see what Russia is doing, helping Iran against Israel activity, against Israel retaliation against Hamas. And this is something that we cannot ignore. So I think that we have to change our policy towards Russia. Again, first and foremost, by changing our pattern of help to Ukraine. We cannot allow the Russians to win Ukraine because Russian winning in Ukraine is a win of Iran in Ukraine, and the implication on that, also in the Middle East, will be very negative to Israel. So Israel needs to do the utmost to help Ukraine in its war against Russia. This is one important thing. Now, the questions regarding our political activity or decision makers, it's very hard to tell. I think that we, as a think tank, need to highlight that and highlight the need to rethink our policy. You know, Israel is highly involved in different issues right now in terms of the war in Gaza, in terms of political turmoil that we have today in Israel. So I'm not sure we are willing to do this rethinking. But we need to remember that our previous Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, actually changed our posture regarding Russia. He actually wasn't ready even to talk to President or dictator Putin, as you called it. So I think there are venues to change the policy. I'm not sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu today, given the problem that Israel is facing today, will be willing to rethink it. But I think that one of the outcomes of the war that hopefully will end soon is the Israeli need to rethink its policy towards Russia. It's not something that we have to do. It's something that we must do, because otherwise we lose a lot of support by the Western countries. And I think this is a vital issue for our consideration into the future.
Mm-hmm. What Ukrainians asked for Israel for a long time is the weapon systems. Can we expect, if, let's say, the Israeli political will support the idea of supporting Ukraine, can we expect some arms deals between Israel and Ukraine in the nearest future?
Well, I hope so. As you know, Israel has advanced technological capabilities into a weapon system. Israel military.
Iron Dome, for example.
Yeah, exactly. For example, Iron Dome, but other systems that I think Israel can offer. Israel defense industries are highly advanced, and I think that we can really help. And you can see how we, for example, how we coped with the Iranian attack on the 14th of April. We managed to intercept more than 90% of the weapons being sent to Israel. So Israel has vast capabilities in that regard, and I hope that some of them will be able to sell it. But of course, it's connected to the political decision maker, and I really hope that it will make an effect in terms of what Russia is doing today. We cannot ignore the fact that the Russians are helping our biggest enemy, Iran. And if we'll ignore that, we'll just play to the hands of Russia and Iran itself. So I'm not saying cut off relations with Russia. I think we can preserve connection with Moscow, but in parallel to that, we have to make sure that the Ukrainians will get what they need to get in order to help them to counter Iran and Russia activity. As you all know, the drones that are being launched by the Russians are the same drones that are being launched against Israel from Lebanon, from Iraq, from other places. So we need to share information, we need to share knowledge, and also we need to share technology that will help the Ukrainians to cope with this kind of an attacks.
Mm-hmm. In the end of the day, if this cooperation will continue in the future, I mean, between Russia and Iran and also with China, what threats it will bring not only for the Middle East but also for Europe?
It's an important question because, as I mentioned, we are not tackling or facing countries. We are facing an axis. And this kind of cooperation increases the capabilities of this axis. North Korea increased the threat on its neighbors, for example, Japan and South Korea. Just imagine if the Iranians will give the knowledge regarding drones capabilities to the North Korean, how it will have an effect on the South Korean. We talked about, of course, how the Russians can help the Iranians improve their conventional capabilities or nuclear one, and that can put a danger on Israel. But of course, all of that also connected to the danger regarding what's happening in Europe. The fact that the Iranians are supporting Russia in that regard is helping them in having an upper hand in the war in Ukraine, but also improving these kind of capabilities in terms that the Russians will now have a joint factory with the Iranians, and the drones capabilities will be an integral part of the Russian capabilities against any sort of adversary in Europe in the future. So first and foremost, we need to help our friends in Europe to build this kind of defense against these kind of capabilities. But it's not stopping over there, because we all know that the Russians ask the Iranians for short-range missiles as well. So again, Iranian missiles, the Fatah 110, will be maybe transferred, or will be already been transferred to Russia to be used against Ukraine. So again, today is against Ukraine, tomorrow it can be another adversary, a Russian adversary, as they think in Europe itself. So we need to monitor everything that moves between Iran and Russia. We need to monitor because Russia will use that. We have to think hard and clear how to tackle it, how to cope with it, how to make sure that at the end of the day, they're not building the capabilities in a way that will threaten Israel and Europe itself. So the bottom line of things, we are facing an axis, and everything that this axis build and develop will be aimed against us. Us, meaning the democratic free world, whether it's Israel, Latvia, or other countries in Europe, and of course the US.
The non-residential fellow of the think tank Atlantic Council, Denijs Citrinovics, was our guest. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.